think we make a mistake in talking about anti-Semitism as a prejudice. Anti-Semitism starts as an organized political movement to deny Jews civic equality in Germany, right? That's how the term is coined. So if we ignore the political roots of the term, the political aspects of the phenomenon, we're misunderstanding what it is. It's not simply a hate. Anti-Semitism has always been political. It's about Jews don't have and don't deserve to have, as individuals, the same rights as other people, even up into the right to life.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of The Contrarian Podcast. I'm your host, David Bernstein. I'm joined by my co-host here, Phil Siegel, who has been joining me in this series on what I've been calling the new anti-Zionism, where we explore a crop of scholars and thinkers who have come to the fore to argue about and push forward ideas around fighting the anti-Zionism that we're seeing in our ranks, and to what degree is it related to anti-Semitism or springs from anti-Semitism? To what degree should we be treating it as its own distinct phenomenon? These are the kinds of questions that we've been asking our guests and asking ourselves and struggling with, and hope to come to some conclusions on in the days ahead. So we are very delighted to have with us Shaul Kelner, who is a professor of sociology and Jewish studies at Vanderbilt. Did I get that right?
Correct.
He's also, a public intellectual. He's someone who doesn't confine his ideas and thoughts to the academy, but writes important articles, like he did recently in the journal Sources on American anti-Zionism. I got that right? That's the title.
That's the title.
And
yeah.
a very, very, very powerful piece, I thought, that got to a lot of the issues that we've been discussing, but we're here to give voice to some of that on this podcast today. So thank you for joining us.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me.
All right. So there seems to be a new sort of discipline or sub-discipline emerging to sort of look at anti-Zionism as a phenomenon in its own right. How do you characterize this moment and this sort of move among people like yourself and Adam Lewis Klein and Andrew Pessin and Nielect and some others who have been chiming in on these issues? How do you characterize this movement now?
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at the group of scholars who were thinking about this, some of them have their roots in the Soviet Union. So that would be Isabella, Naya. I spent the past, 2 decades studying the oppression of Jews in the Soviet Union, and they were very clear that they were not anti-Semitic and they were anti-Semitism. They defeated Hitler after all, and yet we know how they treated Jews. So they had a language that justified it. That language was anti-Zionism. So I'm also thinking about it from that perspective. I don't have, unlike Isabella and Naya, the personal experience. I don't have the personal experience of Soviet anti-Zionism, during the Cold War, having lived through that. And then with regard to Adam Louis Klein, like myself, we're both coming out of social science traditions. So he studies anthropology, I study sociology. And I think that what's notable there is that we're not intellectual historians. We're looking at social phenomena that are around us, and we're trained to study what we're seeing empirically as a social phenomenon in its own right. So, we're not getting that caught up in the history of the debates over what word or the like. If people are doing things to other Jews and are saying that they're not anti-Semitic, they're anti-Zionist, we'll take that as the starting point and say, okay, so this is what anti-Zionism does. How do we understand it?
Right. So I was having a conversation with one of the aforementioned people that about this earlier today, and I'll use the gender specific she, was telling me that that there are voices within this sort of new movement who say, look, obviously anti-Semitism itself is a problem, but I'd like us to spend time with anti-Zionism in its own right. It is a form of bigotry to claim that that a state should be eliminated. That is insane. And so rather than struggle to show the link between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, we should start dealing with anti-Zionism as a form of bigotry and racism in its own right. What do you think about that?
So, look, I'm a sociologist, and I am not a psychologist. And as a sociologist, I will insist that we not psychologize collective phenomena. So I don't know what's in people's hearts. There are a lot of people who have mobilized and done a lot of things in the name of anti-Zionism, and each individual has their own psychology, and I don't like talking about a collective psychology. So I'm very resistant to speaking of anti-Zionism as a prejudice or a hate, which I think reduces a social movement, a political phenomenon, a collective problem into something that's just a matter of hearts and minds. I don't think it's a matter of hearts and minds. I think it's a matter of organized action by activist groups and networks. It's coordinated. And if we only see it as a prejudice, if we only see it as hate, as a bad psychology, we're missing the sociological dimensions, the political dimensions of the phenomenon. So that is a disciplinary bias that I bring as a sociologist to say, let's not reduce everything to sociology. And, people can be engaging in some very, very bad behaviors, even if they don't feel hate in their hearts. And it doesn't really particularly matter to me whether they feel hate in their hearts or not. I'm much more concerned about what people are actually doing.
Right. So you're not spending a lot of time worrying about what its connection is to anti-Semitism then. You're just identifying a troubling social phenomenon, and you're saying this is dangerous, this is bad, and we need to oppose it.
Well, look, I would analyze anti-Semitism the same way. I think we make a mistake in talking about anti-Semitism as a prejudice. Anti-Semitism starts as an organized political movement to deny Jews civic equality in Germany, right? That's how the term is coined. So if we ignore the political roots of the term, the political aspects of the phenomenon, we're misunderstanding what it is. It's not simply a hate. Anti-Semitism has always been political. It's about Jews don't have and don't deserve to have, as individuals, the same rights as other people, even up into the right to life, right? So I'm consistent, and I think about anti-Semitism as a politics. I think about anti-Zionism as a politics. And then I am interested in looking at how do they relate? Where are they similar? Where are they different?
Yes, that's the question. How do they relate as the politics of anti-Semitism and the politics of anti-Zionism? No, two questions actually. How do they relate, and how should we, those who are opposed to both, relate them in the way that we take them on?
Yeah. Look, you can find both political phenomena, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, on both sides of the political spectrum, but they tend to cluster differently. So anti-Semitism, that is to say, an othering of Jews, a denial of Jewish right to equality based on notions of Jewish individual difference, racial difference, cultural inferiority, that stuff is primarily concentrated on the political right, and it has always been. And anti-Zionism, by contrast, which is opposed to Jews' claims to political rights as a collective, right? The right to self-determination, the right to having a state of their own, that tends to be concentrated on the political left. And, because political right and political left hate each other and they fight with each other all the time, these traditions sort of emerge separately. However, once you have an anti-Jewish politics out there that creates different types of public culture and images and stereotypes and memes and tropes, these are resources that are available to anyone who wants to construct an anti-Jewish politics. So you can pick and choose and mix and match. So these things will come together and look similar in some instances, but the people who practice them, I think, understand that they're different. The neo-Nazis don't think of themselves as the campus protesters, or the anti-Zionist campus protesters, right? But they'll wear different types of masks when attacking Jews, but they're in their different camps and they're coming from different histories.
So can I push on this? Yeah, push on this one step further, even, Shaul. I heard you on another podcast talking about this, and it kind of sent a chill up my neck in that I started to think, are we psyching ourselves out by arguing about terminology, right? Is this anti-Semitism? Is that anti-Zionism? Is because I think the interviewer was trying to get you to talk about whether the Washington D.C. killer, whether that was an anti-Semitic act or not. And you said, and I'll paraphrase because I don't remember the exact words. You said it doesn't really matter. The guy killed people. There was violence, against people, against Jews, and so forth. And we're, sitting around trying to discuss whether this was anti-Semitic or not, and that misses the point, and we lose out. Talk a little bit more about that kind of viewpoint, and are we, kind of our own worst enemy in this whole terminology game?
Yeah. Look, if you talk to people who will self-define themselves as anti-Zionist and who will exclude Jews, boycott Jews, in some instances, the few extremes murder Jews, they'll say that they're not anti-Semitic. Okay, so do we want to get caught up in a debate as to whether they are anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic? When we can just look at what they're doing and saying, well, I don't care what you label it. What you're doing is hateful. There, I'm becoming psychologizing. But what you're doing is othering Jews. It's treating Jews differently and worse. And if the label that you want to use for it is anti-Zionism, okay, we'll take your label, but you have to own all of the violence that's being done in the name of the label that you're embracing. So you don't get a pass on attacking Jews by saying that I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. So in that sense, the labels, the labels don't matter, and we should not get caught up in the debate. There's violence that's being justified by people who are themselves using different ideologies to justify it. Anti-Semites will tend to justify what they're doing in terms of racism, in terms of all stereotypes about Jewish conspiracy and the like. And anti-Zionists will justify what they're doing in terms of Jews as colonizers, white supremacists, the litany. Genocide, all that stuff. So, I think analytically, it's helpful to us to distinguish the two because the two are rooted in different political traditions. One is rooted in the extremism of the political right. The other is rooted in the extremism of the political left. And so in terms of understanding where these movements are coming from, how they're sustained, that's important for us to understand. But I also think that but anti-Zionists don't get an out to deny the violence they're doing by saying that they're not anti-Semitic. And when we try to say, yeah, but really what you did was anti-Semitic, we're wasting our time and theirs.
Mm-hmm. So what should we say?
This is anti-Zionist violence, and it's just as bad as anti-Semitic violence. Actually, what I've argued in the sources piece is that in a lot of ways, what anti-Zionism in the States right now is actually worse, because it is more intellectually legitimized. That is to say, it has its home in the academy, right? You don't have great intellectuals in the neo-Nazi sphere right now, okay? And so anti-Zionists have intellectual resources. They have intellectual legitimacy that gives that ideology much more cover, and allows it to be tolerated by people who would otherwise be very, very resistant to tolerating an ideology that promotes violence, that degrades Jews, degrades human beings, and the like. It's also something that we're more likely as Jews to encounter, because by and large, Jews politically are like 75% Democratic, 25% Republican. The circles that we travel in tend to be more left. We live in blue areas. Yeah.
We live in blue areas. Yeah. I looked at the data on this. The top 10 Jewish communities in the United States are all in areas that voted for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. I mean, even in the places where Trump didn't win by large margins. Still went. I'm sorry that Kamala. Yeah. So places like Atlanta, for example, still went Harris. And we it's in our backyard. We're not experiencing America First brand of anti-Semitism in our public schools, but we are experiencing the anti-Zionism in our public schools, and so therefore, and the other argument that I make about this is that we actually have more leverage in fighting anti-Semitism on the left because we have political capital on the left and in the places where we live, we can mobilize there. But if there's anti-Semitism on the political right, in a place in Oklahoma where no Jews live, I have very little to say. I probably won't even know about it, but I have very little leverage to bring to the table there.
And this also goes to the point of mislabeling. If we mislabel anti-Zionism from the left as anti-Semitism, it will make potential allies on the left more resistant, because they're going to say, no, they're on the left. They can't be anti-Semites because that's a phenomenon of the right. So we can escape that trap by saying, look, we're experiencing a form of othering, political othering on the left. They're calling it anti-Zionism. This is what's in our own backyards, in our own front yards, in our schools, and in our business workplaces. We have to confront it here, and we should not be pointing our finger over. Oh, well, look at the political right. We Jews on the left can do their work in their own spaces, in the spaces of the left.
Yeah. One more thing on this. Adam Fuller, who's a professor of Jewish studies at Youngstown State University, argues that he doesn't agree with this sort of overall direction. He said, "Is it the anti-Zionists have been saying for years that they're not anti-Semitic, and they're going to welcome this. They're going to say, finally, you're acknowledging we're not anti-Semitic. Okay, so we don't like your state. We don't like other states. They probably only single out Israel, but never mind. We don't like your state, and we don't think your state, as it's currently constructed, exists." So he thinks we're just letting them off the hook.
Yeah, okay, that's a tactical argument. Look, I'm a sociologist. I have to say what I think is analytically correct, and I think analytically these are two related but distinct political phenomena. One is born on the left. One is born on the left. There's a really strong Soviet tradition of it. One is rooted in the right. They both had totalitarian governments that made the state policy, made it part of their foreign policy. So to conflate the two, I think, is analytically problematic. We owe it to ourselves to be honest about about the situations that we're confronting. If tactically it's problematic, and we can deal with that. But honestly, I say, look, okay, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is worse. So don't think that by saying, oh, it's not anti-Semitism, you're actually getting off the hook. And it's worse in a number of ways. And I've mentioned a few, but there are others. It's much, much more likely, anti-Zionism, to be institutionalized, right? So anti-Semitism in the States will largely take the form of incidents, attacks at the individual level, right? Anti-Zionists they're organizing within schools, within unions, within academic organizations, and they're creating institutional policies. So for anyone who has studied anything about critical race theory and thinks about racism or discrimination in systemic, institutional, structural terms, anti-Zionism is a much more institutionalized, systemic, structural form of discrimination against Jews here and now in the US than American anti-Semitism currently is. And all that can change.
Yeah, that's a very interesting lens, because we're starting to see some of the anti-Semites on the right try to adopt the language of anti-Zionism because they think it's more acceptable. And so, talk a little bit about that and how that's just in a way that's kind of fake, but it's clever, right?
It's a good point. And hearing you say that, is making me think, all right, it's a real success of the anti-Zionist movement that it's gained so much legitimacy that anti-Semites are embracing it because it sells better in the US. It has intellectual legitimacy. It crosses now both sides of the political aisle. Yeah. So you can get farther with an anti-Jewish politics that's anti-Zionist then you can that's anti-Semitic, and even the anti-Semites realize that now.
Yeah. And it's interesting because now coming back around to what you just said is very similar. David Hirsch had a really good statement, I thought, that was very memorable. He said, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism both sell because there's a market for it. And so, essentially, Tucker Carlson-ish people have decided or looked at it and said, that market is more ripe right now. So yeah, I'm going to sell into that market instead of the other one that I've been selling into before.
For sure.
Well, we spent a lot of time musing with David Hirsch on why anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, or let's say anti-Semitism, is so deeply embedded in the subconscious of our society that it's always there for the taking when conditions call for it. And both all of us were really sort of asking ourselves, like, why is that the case? I mean, it clearly is the case that it's there, and you think it's disappeared, but then you find out it's just latent, and as soon as there's the opportunity it emerges again. You're a sociologist. Help us understand why that might be the case, if it is the case.
There's a concept in sociology called cultural toolkits. There's a great sociologist named Ann Swidler. She's actually Nashville born, but I think most of her career was out in the Bay Area. But I forget, I think it's Stanford, might have been Berkeley. But she's really developed this notion of cultural toolkits that we as cultures have stories that we use to explain what we do. She did the whole study about how people will talk about their relationships, and we will pull from a stock of ready-made images that are there. It's very hard really to think independently. We're just essentially taking ideas from the culture and putting them together in new ways. So from that perspective, any type of anti-Jewish expression just gets thrown into the toolkit, and it's available for use. So if you want to do an anti-Jewish politics, you don't have to invent it from scratch. You can go; it's already been done, and you go and look at what's been done, and you pick and you mix and match in new ways. Boycotts of Jews. Have we heard of this one before? It's not new. It's there. It's ready for the taking. Jews as baby killers. Have you heard that one before? It's there. It's ready for the taking. So I think that is one of the things that helps us to understand continuities over time, across cultures, and how anti-Jewishness, different forms of anti-Jewishness will manifest.
So I'm a classical liberal, which means I like to keep as much of the conversation going and be open to different ideas. And I want the widest possible Overton window. I know there's certain things that, I don't want to discuss with you, whether the Holocaust happened or whether, whatever. There's a lot of things, or whether slavery happened, or I want there to be the largest possible window for conversation. And when you raise critical race theory, critical race theory has, in my mind, two properties. One property is that it diagnoses systemic issues, like you pointed out. But the other one is this sort of, I hate to use the E word, but epistemological. It suggests that it has the only possible diagnosis. In other words, I think Jonathan Haidt one time said it's a little bit like the cuckoo bird. It's not crazy, but it's a little cuckoo. It's not like the cuckoo bird. It kicks the other bird's eggs out of its nest, or goes into their nest and kicks their eggs out. In other words, it doesn't allow all their ideas. And I'm wondering if you have any concerns that this sort of structural diagnosis of anti-Zionism might also be shutting down legitimate debate around issues like, maybe somebody has a good reason to be opposed to a country's right to exist, any country's right to exist. I mean, is the classical liberal duty bound to keep that conversation open and not just diagnose it as a form of structural, bigotry?
That's a good question. I would think to the extent that we're critical of the hard form of critical race theory, then yes. But in terms of the soft form of it, which is recognizing that there are historical continuities, that there are power relationships that persist over time. I think it's important to call attention to that. So you can have the conversations. You can have these conversations about the right for the state to exist, but at the same time, it's important to situate that in a larger historical context of conversations about what political rights Jews should be allowed to have, where it's non-Jews making the decisions, right? So to ignore that history is not really to have a full and honest conversation. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and also, if Israel is the only state that you're concerned about being an ethno state, that's a little bit of a hint that maybe you don't have a universal belief. You have a targeted belief. So can I ask? I mean, and this one's maybe an elephant in the room, because you're the first person, Shaul, that I've heard describe anti-Semitism in the same lens as anti-Zionism. Usually we kind of try to compare anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, but I thought what you said was very unique and important, and I want to ask you more about it, which is anti-Semitism is really a political phenomenon as well. And so then the elephant in the room is you must then believe that we're handling that all wrong.
Yeah.
And so what are we doing wrong there? Even though this is an anti-Zionism podcast, we've got to get to the elephant in the room.
Okay. So, you look at all the incident counts that we do. We have an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. Okay. Now, I have a lot of colleagues here in sociology who study the sociology of health. And there's a concept in the sociology of health about upstream and downstream consequences. So, for example, if you find that there are a lot of people from a certain area that seem to be getting the same type of cancer, you don't just think that, oh, all these people happen to have, there's a lot of cancer going on. You think that, this is a downstream problem. There's something happening upstream that's causing this. So I think we're seeing incidents, we count incidents, and we're ignoring that incidents are the downstream consequence of some upstream problems. What are the upstream problems? That's where we get into the politics. And we miss that. You think about the American conversation about racism, about sexism, about lots of other forms of discrimination and unequal treatment of groups. And in general, they don't talk about incidents. They don't engage in incident counting. They talk about the structures of power that will perpetuate these inequities over time, and somehow Jews have gotten exempted from thinking about the inequities that we've faced in those ways, and I think it's problematic.
Right. Although they would argue, of course, that that because one sign of structural inequality is wealth distribution, and we're on the upper end of the wealth distribution, so we can't not possibly actually be oppressed, and so that's why we don't fit into that.
They're wrong. Okay, you're up. They're wrong. Right. Look, I mean, that right.
I have to acknowledge that because I'm a critic of this sort of one size fits all structural diagnosis of our society. I think that we should be able to talk about different possible explanations for disparities, for example.
Of course.
Groups.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Right. So I get nervous around these structural, even though I recognize that they're sometimes true. Of course, they're sometimes true. I mean, but I want them to remain open so that we're able to question them and not become not into the sort of closed conversation that we see around some forms of critical race theory.
And to allow for the possibility of change and the possibility of improvement, right? A structural explanation alone, is insufficient, but a structural explanation as something that contributes is important. Now, when I was looking at, I'll say both Soviet anti-Zionism, but also American anti-Zionism, I focused in the American anti-Zionism context, I focused a lot on activists and how activists organized. Okay, so that's less structural. That's more about collective action. And so I think that's something to put into the mix as well, right? There are groups that have organized. They're trying to create political change.
And Shaul,
Okay, and they're trying to institutionalize it. They're trying to make it structural, but they're trying to shake things up because, in fact, things did get a lot better for Jews in the United States. I think that's why we're feeling, those of us, who remember the before times are feeling like, whoa, this is something has gone backwards. Now we're being treated in ways that we heard our parents or grandparents talk about, but that most of us of our generations like largely managed to escape.
and so in your opinion, and I don't know if you've studied this or not, um, there's kind of two schools or two potential explanations. There's these groups that, as you're saying, are organized. If you take kind of the most true believer in the group, obviously, they've internalized some beliefs that the movement has. And then you take the least person, and it's very possible they're just there because there's sandwiches and friends and coffee and all that kind of stuff. And we're seeing this even in some of the other protest movements, in the U.S. Where there's, organizers, both money and, kind of work to organize the movements that are clearly true believers and trying to exact change. And then then there's the foot soldiers, if you will. How many of the foot soldiers really believe, or has anybody studied this? Is it 10%? Is it 90%? Or is it just, I love being around my friends?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know if anyone who's actually studied that. Certainly the campus activists had an incentive to portray the movement as a groundswell of spontaneous revulsion at what Israel was doing in Gaza. Okay, that's a strategic framing. It's a deliberate obfuscation and denial of the actual work that activists had to put in to make those demonstrations happen. Now, I studied activism to free Soviet Jews, the 30-year mass mobilization. By the 1980s, we're able to turn out hundreds of thousands of people to the law in Washington, the
I
mall
was
in Washington,
there.
D.C. All
I
right.
was there. Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, so in 1963,
organized buses.
1964, yeah, 1963, 64, the first activists, they were trying to get people. It was so hard. It took a long time. They did an enormous amount of work to actually build a movement. Movements don't just erupt. They need to be organized. And so, in terms of, so I think when you're looking at the campus protests, you're seeing the results of very, very successful organization and mass mobilization. The people who turned out may have turned out for the sandwiches, because we know that the anti-Zionist sandwiches are fantastic, okay? But while they're there, they may begin to develop emotions, to feel that they learn by doing. So whatever their motivations were for showing up may not be the motivations that they leave with at the end. And that's also a part of effective mass mobilization. So I said before, I'm resistant to psychologizing it, but there's definitely a psychology to protest, and the psychology to protest, part of it is what happens while you're doing it and the emotions that get generated, and then the nostalgia that you're going to feel for that time when you really felt like you made a difference in the world. That's going to be that's a big long-term danger for Jewish communities, the nostalgia that a lot of these campus protesters are going to feel, when they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, for that time when they were really fighting what they thought was the good fight, and we Jews were the enemy in their good fight.
So I'm going to ask you to deviate from your maybe I'm not asking you to deviate from your sociological orientation here. Are we screwed? Are we Jews? Like Phil and I recently wrote an article about how Jews need to see themselves as having agency in the current moment and to take control over the narrative and to build a new partnerships, and to stand up for American civic values as the counterbalance against this scourge of hostility, and to rebuild the center of American politics, yada yada yada. And there's some part of me in the back of my brain that's like, none of this is going to work. We're just screwed. Like these relentless forces of political polarization are not stoppable by any human beings, and that it's just going to get worse and worse until something crazy happens and things change at some point. But who knows when or if that's going to happen? What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, you're asking me to deviate from being a sociologist, because sociologists don't.
Yeah, to a futurist. I want you to be a futurist.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we can't predict the future. That was one of the big mistakes, Jewish community in the 1970s, 80s, 90s kept looking to the sociologists to predict the future. We can't predict the future. We can tell you present trends continued, right? But I mean, we've just lived through the 2 decades of present trends have not continued. Change happens in revolutionary ways. So the wheels turn. Certainly this is a dangerous time. It's a frightening time. It's a threatening time. Things might get worse before they get better. But we are people who have survived, and when you survive, you see ups and you see downs, and you see ups and you see downs, right? That's going to continue happening. So are we screwed? Nah. And also, should we stop fighting? No. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. It's not your job to finish the work, but you're not free to desist from doing it, So have hope. You can have hope. It's different from being optimistic. It's being hopeful, right?
Yeah, I hear you. I'm just trying to decide whether I'm optimistic or not. If I'm authentically optimistic, I'm politically optimistic, but am I authentically optimistic? And I agree. Look, I don't know what AI is going to do to the world, good, bad, or the ugly. So I have to then fight the good fight as long as I can, not knowing how the world is about to change. Perhaps.
Look, one of the things that as American Jews we have always done is we've found ways to make our situation meaningful, no matter what the times were like. So we'll continue to do that. The Judaism that we're going to end up creating, the Judaism that we'll create in darker times is going to look different from the Judaism that we have created in brighter times. But it will be one that's going to speak to the moment and speak to our needs, and it'll still be part of this authentic chain of tradition. So we'll still contribute something new.
Phil, anything else?
Well, I'll ask what you just asked in a different way, which is, and again,
are we really screwed?
Yes, the qualifier, please.
I'm gonna actually put a finer point on that, and not focus on numbers necessarily, because obviously the Holocaust numbers were dramatic, but the Soviet purge was also pretty large as well. And so the thing, the last two change catalysts were essentially purges, and so how do we make sure that the next catalyst isn't a purge? Well, I mean, the Holocaust, we lost, a very large part of our population. The Soviet purge, a lot of Jews killed, but not as many, but certainly cleansed. How do we make sure that, to David's point, not that we're screwed, we're going to survive as a people, but the question is, how do we survive without, a mass casualty event? If that's a sociological.
Okay. Yeah. No, but I take issue with the premise in terms of like major changes that we saw. You neglected the creation of the state of Israel.
Good point. Yeah.
Right. The mass migration to the U.S. as well, and all the stuff that we've built here. So I would add those two.
We moved to the two safest points, right? The two safest poles for sure. The U.S. and Israel.
Yeah, look, we do better. We do better when there is overall stability in the world, and when there's not, we do worse, and so does all of humanity. So, it's not just a Jewish question. I think I will say part of the Zionist response and the Bundist response was to think politically, to think structurally, to make sure that the political base for Jewish flourishing is secure. And one of the things that as American Jews we have tended not to do is to think in those larger structural terms. I think that's something that we need to bring back. But again, I told you, I think anti-Semitism is political. I think anti-Zionism is political. So you won't be surprised to hear me say that I think that our response needs to be much more self-aware and proactive about thinking about what types of political systems and structures do we need to build to create Jewish flourishing. If I were to form a political party right now, I would call it the Extreme Moderate Party. I'd be extremely moderate, because I know we're at a cultural time when this extremism is, it's all the rage. But I'm moderate. I'm in the center, and there's no one who's like really passionate about holding that. I would be fighting against gerrymandering everywhere, because we do worse when we get the extremes of the Republican Party and the extremes of the Democratic Party into power. And when in gerrymandered systems, that's what we're going to get. That's what we've been getting. So I want I don't know if the viewers are going to be able to see this, but all of the boxes on the screen that we're looking at around our pictures and our names are all in purple. That's what I'm looking for. Many, many more purple spaces and bring people together. That's the type of stuff that we need to do.
And I think Jews, by the way, do better in purple spaces. I think we do better. And Phil and I have been talking a lot about maybe in blue areas in red states that have a certain purple quality to them. I was in Miami,
like Nashville, where I live.
Yep, and Austin.
Yeah, Nashville. I was in Miami a few weeks ago, and it felt very good to be Jewish there. It felt also more ideologically diverse there, and I felt you could actually have conversations there more easily than you could where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is through and through blue. And I'm working on an article. Jews should all move to Miami, which is of course Nashville and Austin. You could throw that in as well. But I think I do think that that's where we're going to find at least a certain kind of Jewish person is going to find the most accepting environment and where there's going to be the most Jewish flourishing. And by the way, I've got a piece coming out very soon on building the Jewish middle and why that should be the Jewish mission of today. Actually, I would love to explore writing something like that with you down the line, Shaul, because I think we really have to flesh out a framework for what that means and how that work can be done. And it really, I'm not sure you can fight gerrymandering. And the question is, do you re-engineer what happened? In other words, try to get rid of gerrymandering. I would if I thought if it could be done. Or do you say, okay, what are the pressure points in the current political system that allow us to fight back most effectively? And let's push on those rather than try to win an unwinnable fight with gerrymandering.
An unwinnable battle. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, this has been extremely helpful and thought great, and really appreciate your insights and it's and I know we agree on a lot, and it's but it's wonderful to get your sort of the take of a sociologist as well into the mix.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you. Thanks for all the work you're doing.
Yeah.
You too.
We really enjoyed it. Thanks,
Okay.
Shaul.
All right, Phil. So another interesting conversation with a slight twist. It's good that these conversations don't all sound exactly alike. We're talking to people who agree a lot with us, but also have their own unique takes. I think Shaul brought the perspective of the sociologist, which was interesting, and the way he sees both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as political movements, not forms of bigotry. What did you think about that?
Yeah, that was definitely the differential. Something, really, I thought very different than anything we've heard from the others. Everybody brings, a couple of really interesting nuggets for sure. But if you think about it, Andrew's a philosopher, Rona's a lawyer, Naya is kind of a
She's a
philosopher.
Russian. I think she's yeah.
Russian
She's
literature,
an educator too.
yeah, but humanities. And I think the humanities people definitely come at this issue differently than the social scientists. And so, kind of taking both viewpoints and melding them together, I think is really important. And this whole, I think everybody's got this agreement that it is a movement. Anti-Zionism is a movement that needs to be either countered or at least understood. Some have different views of Jews that are anti-Zionist versus others that are anti-Zionist. But this lens of it being a political movement and therefore the implications for anti-Semitism, not just anti-Zionism, to me, kind of blew my mind a little bit today. I thought that was, some great learning.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be interesting to sort of compare and contrast these perspectives and sort of give a lay of the land of this emerging discipline.
Yeah. You and I are going to have to hash it out on this. Are we screwed or not screwed?
I know.
But, I think that there is a social science study here that almost has to happen, because we asked Shaul, has anybody done the study of, is it just, three puppet masters like Neville Singham in the background, and everybody else is just a foot soldier, useful idiot, which obviously can't just be three. But maybe it's only 300 or 3,000 people that are really driving this movement. And, and then there's a few true belief. What is the hierarchy of belief here? How does it change over time? Because I think that is what's needed to answer your question.
But the interesting thing is, like, I've grown up at a time, and you're a little older than me, but not much, when there was this sense that history was unfolding in a very predictable way. Like we were experiencing sort of the dawn of a new age, that the arc of history bends forward. I'm probably butchering this metaphor
towards justice.
Justice,
yes.
Bends
I never
forward.
believed that, but
right. But there was, I had a sense of what the next 10 years, at least in my own mind, were likely to look like politically and so forth. I don't even know what it's going to look like at 8 p.m. tonight. This is when Trump is talking about wreaking havoc on Iran. It feels, history, the forces of our society and our world feel much more chaotic to me right now than they did in 1995 or 2005, and maybe even 2015. Although 2015, I was starting to already feel that things were coming apart, and so I find it very hard to say anything with great assuredness in this environment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you had said at any time in the last 30 years that we would be in a conflict with Iran and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia would be our allies, and that Spain is pushing hard for us to stop and isn't cooperating, I think people would have stared at you like you were a nutcase. And yet here we are.
Yet here we are. Well, we're gonna, more on that, I'm sure.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think it's a wrap. Thank you, Phil. And I think we're going to do one more in this series, and then we'll share our grand analysis.
Awesome. Thanks, David.
Thanks.